A millionaire noticed a little girl, on the verge of fainting from hunger, standing in the rain outside a grocery store. When he handed her a piece of fruit, he spotted an object that left him speechless. The sound of raised voices echoed through the small house, seeping through the thin walls of Sophie's bedroom. The 5-year-old clutched her teddy bear against her chest, wide eyes fixed on the closed door. She couldn't understand all the words, but the angry tone was unmistakable. "You can't go on like this, Anne." Grandma Claire's voice sounded exasperated. "Stay out of my life, Mum," Anne retorted, her voice choked with sobs. Sophie shrank even further into her bed, silent tears rolling down her chubby cheeks. Her gaze wandered across the room and settled on the dresser, where the old butterfly brooch given to her by Grandma Claire lay. Its shimmering wings seemed to beckon, promising an escape from the suffocating atmosphere. With hesitant steps, Sophie climbed off the bed. Her little bare feet made scarcely any noise on the cold floor as she approached the dresser. She picked up the brooch, her tiny fingers stroking the delicate wings. For a moment she hesitated, glancing at the closed door where the sounds of argument still came from. Then, determined, she tucked the brooch into her pajama pocket and walked to the window. The sky outside was cloudy, but Sophie did not pause. With surprising agility for her age, she opened the window and climbed into the small garden. The wet grass tickled her bare feet, but she kept going. With one last look at the house, Sophie ran into the street, leaving behind the only home she had ever known. The streets of the large city were an intimidating labyrinth for little Sophie. Tall buildings cast menacing shadows, and the roar of traffic was deafening. She hurried along, looking back every few steps, afraid she might see her mother or grandma chasing after her. Hours passed, and Sophie kept walking. Her feet ached, her stomach rumbled, but she did not dare stop. The sky, once merely overcast, began to darken quickly. The first drops of rain started to fall, cold against her flushed skin. The rain intensified, soaking Sophie's thin pajamas. She shivered, her teeth chattering from the cold. The streets, bustling before, were now nearly deserted. People rushed for shelter from the storm. Sophie looked around frantically, searching for a safe spot. That was when she saw, across the street, the bright facade of a grocery store. Summoning the last of her strength, Sophie dashed across the road, nearly slipping on the wet sidewalk. She reached the store entrance and huddled under the small awning, hugging her knees to her chest. There, sheltered from the rain yet still trembling with cold and hunger, Sophie finally let out the sobs she had been holding in for so long. Her tears mixed with the raindrops on her face as she watched cars go by, their lights reflecting in the puddles. With trembling fingers, Sophie took the butterfly brooch out of her pocket. Under the store's dim light, its wings looked even more magical. She clutched the brooch against her chest, as though it were a protective talisman. "Mommy, Grandma," Sophie whispered, her voice nearly drowned out by the drumming rain. Nightfall arrived, and Sophie fought against sleep, fear, and hunger. Her heavy eyes observed people going in and out of the grocery store, none of them noticing the small figure curled up at the entrance. The smell of fresh bread drifting from inside made her stomach growl painfully. Sophie had no idea how long it had been since she fled home. It felt like an eternity. She thought of her warm bed, her teddy bear, her mother's smile on good days. A new wave of sobs shook her. That was when a luxury car pulled up in front of the grocery store. Half asleep with exhaustion, Sophie watched as a commanding figure stepped out, protecting himself from the rain with a black umbrella. The man headed to the store entrance, his decisive footsteps echoing on the wet sidewalk. As he came closer, his eyes locked with Sophie's. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The man stopped, his expression shifting from surprise to concern. Sophie squeezed the brooch tighter, her heart pounding. Neither of them knew it yet, but in that instant, their lives were about to change forever. The gentle purr of the Bentley's engine was almost lost beneath the drumming of rain on the car's roof. Paul set the windshield wiper to its highest speed, his eyes carefully on the dark, slippery streets. The city, usually so vibrant, looked like a grey blur through the fogged windows. His fingers tapped the leather steering wheel, the only outward sign of the restlessness he felt inside. Another day of endless meetings, negotiations, and decisions that affected thousands of lives. Paul let out a weary sigh, feeling the weight of his 60 years more than ever. The traffic light up ahead turned red, and Paul slowed to a stop. His gaze wandered across the street, coming to rest on the bright facade of a grocery store. That was when he saw her. A small figure huddled at the entrance, visibly shivering even from a distance. Paul blinked, uncertain whether his eyes were deceiving him. But no, it really was a child, a little girl, from what he could tell, no older than 5 or 6. The light turned green, but Paul didn't move. Cars behind him honked impatiently, but he barely heard them. His eyes remained fixed on the girl, his heart clenching in a way he hadn't felt in years. Almost without realizing it, Paul turned on his blinker and maneuvered the car to the other side of the street, parking in front of the store. He grabbed his umbrella from the passenger seat and stepped out, immediately hit by the cold wind and rain. As he approached the store entrance, Paul could see the girl more clearly. Her thin pajamas were drenched, her dark hair plastered to her pale face. She was shaking uncontrollably, her arms wrapped around her knees. Their eyes met, and Paul felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. The girl's big, frightened eyes held a world of sadness and fear. For a moment, Paul was paralyzed, unsure what to do. "Hello," he finally said, his voice softer than usual. "Are you all right? Where are your parents?" The girl did not reply, only stared at him with those huge, terrified eyes. Paul noticed she was clutching something in her small hands, but he couldn't see what it was. On impulse, Paul entered the grocery store. The warmth and the smell of fresh bread hit him, a stark contrast to the cold outside. He quickly walked through the aisles, picking up a shiny red apple from the fruit section. At the checkout, he hesitated for a moment before adding a package of cookies and a bottle of water to his purchase. Stepping back outside, Paul approached the girl again. He crouched down, ignoring the protest in his knees, to meet her at eye level. "Here," he said gently, offering the apple. "You must be hungry." The girl looked from the apple to Paul, mistrust evident on her face. Slowly, as though afraid the fruit might vanish, she extended a trembling hand and took it. It was at that moment Paul saw what she held in her other hand. A brooch. Not just any brooch, but one shaped like a butterfly, with delicate wings encrusted with tiny stones that sparkled even in the dim light. The world seemed to stop. Paul felt the air rush out of his lungs as though he'd been struck. His mind spun, long-buried memories surfacing. Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Startled by Paul's sudden change in tone, the girl clutched the brooch to her chest, tears welling in her eyes. Paul immediately realized his mistake. Forcing himself to relax, he tried to smile, though his heart was pounding furiously. "It's all right," he said softly. "That's a very beautiful brooch. It reminds me of one I saw a long time ago." The girl seemed to relax slightly, though she still held the brooch tightly. She took a hesitant bite of the apple, her eyes never leaving Paul. "What's your name?" Paul asked, trying to keep his voice calm despite the storm of emotions inside him. "Sophie," the girl said in a low voice, speaking for the first time. "Sophie," Paul repeated, the name feeling oddly right. "That's a lovely name. I'm Paul. Can you tell me why you're here all alone, Sophie?" Sophie lowered her gaze, biting her lip. I ran away," she whispered. Paul felt his heart tighten. A million possibilities flashed through his mind, none of them good. He knew he had to do something. He couldn't just leave this child alone on the street. "Sophie," he said gently, "it's getting very cold out here. How about we go inside the store where it's warmer? Maybe we can call someone to come pick you up." Panic crossed Sophie's face. "No," she exclaimed. "Please don't tell anyone you saw me." Paul raised his hands in a reassuring gesture. All right. We won't do anything you don't want. But I can't leave you here alone. How about we find someplace safe and warm, and then we can talk more? I promise I won't do anything without your consent." Sophie hesitated, her eyes darting between Paul and the dark, rainy street. Finally, she gave a small nod. Carefully, Paul extended his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Sophie took it, her small, icy hand in his. Leading Sophie to his car, Paul felt the weight of the responsibility he had just assumed. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew his life had just changed irrevocably. The entire time, his mind kept returning to that brooch. The same brooch he hadn't seen in 35 years, the one that belonged to Claire. The gates of the mansion opened silently, allowing the Bentley to enter. Paul guided the car down the long driveway, throwing occasional glances at the passenger seat, where Sophie slept deeply, wrapped in his coat. The butterfly brooch was firmly clutched in her tiny hand, even in sleep. Parking in front of the imposing house, Paul hesitated. What was he doing, bringing a stranger's child to his home in the middle of the night? Part of him knew he should have taken Sophie straight to the police, but something, maybe the brooch, maybe the fear in the girl's eyes, had stopped him. With a sigh, he got out and gently lifted Sophie in his arms. She stirred slightly, but didn't wake. Paul felt a wave of protectiveness he hadn't experienced in decades. Inside, the housekeeper, Mrs. Thompson, met them with wide eyes of surprise. "Mr. Durand!" "What?" Paul cut her off with a gesture. "Please prepare the guest room, and maybe something light to eat." Mrs. Thompson nodded, years of professional discretion overriding her curiosity. Paul carried Sophie to the guest room and gently laid her on the king-size bed that dwarfed her small form. He hesitated, then carefully removed her soaked shoes and covered her with a soft blanket. That was when he noticed the brooch still clasped tightly in Sophie's hand. With trembling fingers, Paul lightly touched the butterfly's wings. The familiar feel of the cold metal and the smooth stones unleashed a flood of memories he had fought to keep buried for 35 years. "Claire." Paul staggered backward, almost tripping over the nearby chair. He sank into it, eyes fixed on the brooch, though his mind was far away in a long-forgotten past. The summer sun shone on the university campus as Paul hurried to his economics class. That was when he saw her for the first time, Claire sitting under a tree, laughing with friends. Her golden hair caught the sunlight, and when their eyes met, Paul felt the world stop. Months of clandestine meetings between classes, nights studying together that turned into conversations until dawn. Claire was everything Paul never knew he wanted. Smart, compassionate, with a sharp wit that made him laugh until his sides hurt. The brooch was a birthday gift. Paul had saved for months to buy it, knowing how much Claire loved butterflies. Her eyes sparkled when she opened it, and the kiss that followed was filled with promises of a future together. Paul closed his eyes, the pain of the memory almost physical. He tasted the salt of tears he hadn't realized he was shedding. The job offer came in the last year of college, a prestigious position at an investment firm in London. It was the opportunity of a lifetime. Paul's chance to prove himself and build the life he'd always dreamed of. But Claire couldn't go. Her family needed her. Her ailing mother depended on her care. She begged Paul to stay, to build a life together right there. The final argument was brutal. Harsh words were exchanged, promises broken. Paul left for London the following week, leaving behind a devastated Claire and a butterfly brooch thrown to the floor of his empty apartment. A slight movement brought Paul back to the present. Sophie shifted in bed, mumbling something unintelligible in her sleep. Paul stood, his joints protesting after sitting still for so long. He walked to the window, watching the rain continue to fall outside. His reflection stared back at him. A 60-year-old man, grey at the temples, worry lines etched into his face. Where had the young man gone, the one so full of ambition and dreams? Paul had always regretted his decision. In the early years in London, he almost returned several times, but pride and fear held him back. Then, as the years passed, it became harder and harder. What would he say? How could he explain? So he buried himself in work. He built an empire, became the successful man he had always wanted to be, but the cost, the emptiness in his heart that no amount of money or success could fill. And now, through some twist of fate, the past had literally shown up on his doorstep in the form of a frightened little girl carrying a familiar brooch. Paul turned his attention back to Sophie. Who was she? How had she gotten Claire's brooch? Was there a connection? He knew he couldn't ignore this. He had to find out the truth, not just for Sophie, but for himself. It was time to face the past he had run from for so long. With a resolve he hadn't felt in years, Paul picked up his phone. He hesitated a moment, then dialed a number he hadn't used in a very long time. "Hello, Jack. It's Paul Durand. I need you to run a discreet investigation for me. It's personal." As he provided details to his old security contact, Paul couldn't tear his eyes away from Sophie. Whoever she was, wherever she had come from, she had unintentionally reopened a wound Paul had thought long healed. But maybe, just maybe, this was also a chance for healing, an opportunity to fix past mistakes and possibly find a redemption he never knew he was searching for. After finishing the call, Paul sat again by the bed. Gently, he adjusted the blanket around Sophie, noticing how she instinctively leaned into his touch. "Don't worry, little one," he whispered. "We'll figure out your story, and maybe in the process I can finally make peace with mine." Outside, the rain began to subside, and a ray of moonlight broke through the clouds, casting a soft glow across the room. The butterfly brooch glinted in Sophie's hand, as if it were a beacon guiding Paul back to a long-forgotten past, and perhaps toward a future he never imagined possible. Morning sunlight filtered through the expensive curtains, casting a golden glow over Paul's office. He was seated in his leather chair, eyes on the computer screen, but his mind was elsewhere. A night of little sleep had left dark circles under his eyes, a physical reminder of the emotional turbulence he was facing. A gentle knock on the door brought him back to the present. "Come in," he called, straightening up. "Mrs. Thompson entered, her face a mask of professional concern. "Mr. Durand, the little girl is awake. She seems a bit frightened." Paul nodded, feeling a mix of anxiety and anticipation. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. I'll go see her now." Walking down the hallway toward the guest room, Paul rehearsed what he would say in his mind. How did one explain this situation to a scared child? How could he earn her trust? He knocked softly before entering. Sophie was sitting on the bed, knees pulled up to her chest, eyes wide as she watched Paul's every move. The butterfly brooch was still clutched in her hand. "Good morning, Sophie," Paul said in a gentle tone. "Did you sleep well?" Sophie nodded hesitantly, her eyes never leaving him. "You must be hungry," he continued, taking a seat on the chair beside the bed. "How about some breakfast? Pancakes, maybe?" At the mention of food, Sophie's stomach rumbled audibly, making her blush. Paul couldn't help but smile. "I'll ask Mrs. Thompson to fix something for us. In the meantime, how about we talk a little?" Sophie bit her lip, clearly nervous. Paul decided to try a different approach. "You know, Sophie, that brooch you have is very special. I once knew someone who had one just like it." Sophie's eyes widened with interest. "Really?" Paul nodded, feeling a pang in his heart. "Yes, it belonged to someone very important to me. Can you tell me how you got it?" Sophie hesitated, her fingers stroking the butterfly's wings. "Grandma gave it to me," she finally whispered. "She said it was magical." Paul felt his heart race. Grandma? Could it be? He was about to ask more questions when his phone vibrated. It was Jack, the investigator. "Sophie, I need to take this call. Mrs. Thompson will be here soon with breakfast, okay?" He stepped into the hallway, closing the door softly behind him. "Jack, what did you find out?" The detective's deep voice crackled on the other end. "Paul, you're not going to believe this. The girl is Claire Dubois' granddaughter." Paul felt as though the floor had vanished beneath his feet. He leaned against the wall, struggling to breathe. How? He finally managed. "Claire had a daughter, and shortly after you left, and is Sophie's mother. Apparently there was a recent family argument. Sophie ran away from home after a fight between Anne and Claire." Paul ended the call, his mind spinning. Claire had a daughter. Could he be? No. He pushed the thought away. The timeline didn't match. Still, the fact that Sophie was Claire's granddaughter was too much to process. Back in the guest room, Paul found Sophie devouring pancakes. He took a seat, watching her in silence, 1,000 questions swirling in his mind. In the days that followed, Paul found himself torn between his desire for answers and his fear of what he might discover. He spent hours with Sophie, reading stories, drawing pictures, trying to gain her trust. Gradually, she began to open up, talking about her school, her friends, her pet cat. But whenever Paul tried to ask about her family, Sophie clammed up. The fear returned to her eyes, and she refused to speak. Meanwhile, Jack's reports kept coming in, painting an ever clearer picture of Claire's life after Paul left. She had become a social worker, dedicating her life to helping children in difficult situations. Anne, her daughter, struggled with depression, causing tension in the family. Each new detail felt like a knife to Paul's heart. He found himself gazing out the window of his office, contemplating the life he could have had. The success and wealth he'd accumulated over the years now seemed hollow in the face of what he'd lost. One night, unable to sleep, Paul wandered the corridors of his mansion. He stopped outside a door he rarely opened, his old music room. With a deep sigh, he turned the knob. The smell of old wood and guitar strings hit him immediately. In the corner, covered by a thin layer of dust, lay his old guitar. Paul picked it up carefully, his fingers tracing the familiar strings. "Play for me, Paul," Claire would laugh, her eyes sparkling in the sunset light. "That song you wrote for me." Paul closed his eyes, letting the memory envelop him. Without thinking, his fingers began to strum the strings, the soft, melancholy melody filling the air. "That's beautiful." Paul turned, startled. Sophie stood in the doorway, her sleepy eyes curious. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to wake you," Paul said softly. Sophie stepped into the room, her eyes roaming over the instruments. "Do you know how to play all these?" Paul smiled, the first genuine smile in days. "Most of them. Want me to teach you something?" Sophie's face lit up. "Can I?" That night, as he showed Sophie the basic chords on the guitar, Paul felt something change inside him. The music he had long forgotten brought back memories of a simpler, happier time. And in Sophie's bright eyes, he saw a glimmer of hope, a chance for redemption. When he finally tucked Sophie back into bed, Paul made a decision. No matter what the past held, he would do whatever it took to protect this child and perhaps in the process find his way back to the person he used to be. Seated in his office, Paul picked up the phone. It was time to face the past head-on. "Jack, I need you to do one more thing for me. Find Claire Dubois. It's time for a long overdue conversation." Paul's office was dimly lit by the early evening sky when Jack, the detective, arrived. His normally impassive face showed signs of fatigue and perhaps a hint of concern. Paul gestured for him to sit, trying to ignore the knot forming in his stomach. "What did you find out, Jack?" Paul asked, his voice rougher than usual. Jack sighed, opening a thick folder on the desk. "Paul, you'd better brace yourself. What we discovered, well, it changes everything." Paul nodded, steeling himself mentally. "Go ahead." "As suspected, Sophie is indeed Claire Dubois' granddaughter," Jack began. "But there's more. Claire had a daughter, Anne, shortly after you left for London." Paul's world seemed to spin. "A daughter? How long after?" Jack consulted his notes. "Anne was born about 9 months after you left, Paul." The air seemed to vanish from the room. Paul stood abruptly and walked over to the window. His mind was in turmoil. Could it be possible? Could he be? "Go on," he finally said, without turning around. Jack cleared his throat. "Claire raised Anne alone, working as a social worker. From what we've gathered, she never married. Anne had a tough childhood, but managed to get a degree in psychology. However, around 6 years ago, she began battling severe depression." Paul finally turned hard, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "And Sophie was born 5 years ago. The father, there's no record of him. Anne has struggled to raise her daughter alone, facing financial and emotional difficulties. In recent months, things have gotten significantly worse." Paul sank into his chair, feeling the weight of every word. "How so?" Jack hesitated before continuing. "Anne lost her job 3 months ago. The bills started piling up. There are records of frequent arguments between her and Claire. It appears Claire has been helping financially, but the situation is tense." A heavy silence fell in the office. Paul closed his eyes. images of the past mingling with these new revelations. Claire, alone and pregnant. Anne, growing up without a father. Sophie, caught in the middle of a family storm. "There's one more thing, Paulie," Jack said gently. "We found Claire's current address. She lives only about 30 minutes away." Paul opened his eyes, looking at Jack with an intensity that surprised even himself. "Thank you, Jack. You've done excellent work." After the detective left, Paul remained seated in silence for a long time. Twilight gave way to night, the city lights twinkling outside like distant stars. Finally, he rose and walked to Sophie's room. The little girl slept peacefully, the butterfly brooch on the bedside table beside her. Paul picked it up, feeling its familiar weight in his hand. How many times had he pictured this object over the years? How many times had he dreamed of Claire's face? And now here it was, not just a piece of his past, but potentially the key to his future. Paul returned to his office and picked up the phone. His hands trembled slightly as he dialed the number. "Hello, Claire Dubois." His voice wavered for a moment. "This is Paul Durand. We need to talk." The silence on the other end felt endless. Finally, the voice he hadn't heard in 35 years, older but still unmistakable, replied, "Paul, my God, after all this time. Claire, I know this is a shock, but something happened. I found Sophie." An audible gasp. "Sophie, is she all right? Where is she?" "She's safe, Claire. She's with me. But there's a lot we need to discuss. Can we meet?" Another pause, shorter this time. "Yes, I suppose we should. Tomorrow, at the cafe near the old campus." "I'll be there," Paul answered, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. After hanging up, Paul walked back to the window, gazing at the city lights. His mind overflowed with unanswered questions. Was Anne his daughter? How would Claire react to seeing him after all these years? And Sophie? How did she fit into all of this? The next morning, Paul stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie for the 10th time. He had barely slept, his mind rehearsing countless scenarios for the meeting with Claire. "Mr. Durand?" Mrs. Thompson's voice broke his thoughts. "Sophie is asking for you." Paul nodded, following the housekeeper to the kitchen. Sophie was sitting at the table, swinging her legs anxiously as she ate cereal. "Good morning, Sophie," Paul said, forcing a smile. "How are you feeling today?" Sophie shrugged, stirring her cereal with a spoon. "When can I go home?" The question hit Paul like a punch to the gut. Of course she wanted to go home. What had he been thinking, keeping her here so long? "Actually, Sophie," he began, taking a seat beside her, "I'm going to meet someone today who might help with that. Your grandma." Sophie's eyes widened. "Grandma Claire?" Paul nodded, surprised by the sudden excitement in the girl's face. "Yes, Grandma Claire. You really love her, don't you?" Sophie grinned, the first genuine smile Paul had seen from her since they met. "Grandma Claire is the best. She always tells me stories and takes me to the park." Paul felt a pang of envy and regret. All those moments, those memories, he could have been part of them. "Sophie," he said gently, "I promise I'll do whatever I can to help you and your family, okay? Trust me." The girl studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Okay, Mr. Paul." Hours later, Paul found himself standing outside the cafe, heart pounding. Through the window, he saw her, Claire. Her once golden hair now bore silver strands. But her eyes, those eyes that had once enchanted him, still burned with the same intensity. Taking a deep breath, Paul opened the door and stepped inside. The tinkling of the bell above the door made Claire look up, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Decades of regrets, unasked questions, and unspoken words hung between them. "Hello, Claire," Paul said softly. Claire rose slowly, her eyes never leaving his. "Paul," she responded, her voice a mix of surprise, hurt, and maybe, just maybe, a hint of hope. As Paul took a seat at the table, he knew his life was about to change forever. The revelations to come, the truths that would be unearthed, everything hinged on this moment. With one last glance at the butterfly brooch in his pocket, Paul prepared to face his past and, possibly, take the first step toward a future he had never dared imagine. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the small cafe, but Paul barely noticed. His gaze was fixed on Claire, absorbing every detail of her face. The fine lines around her eyes told of laughter and tears, while the silver streaks in her hair shone under the cafe's gentle light. "You haven't changed much," Claire finally said, breaking the tense silence. Paul let out a short, humorless laugh. "I think we've all changed, Claire, some more than others." Claire nodded slowly, her fingers fiddling with the coffee cup in front of her. 35 years is a long time, Paul. Why now? Why after all this time?" Paul took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the brooch in his pocket. "I found Sophie," he said softly, watching Claire's reaction. Her eyes widened in a mixture of relief and worry. "Where? How? Is she all right?" "She's safe," Paul reassured her quickly. "I found her a few days ago, alone in the rain. She had this with her." Slowly, he took the butterfly brooch from his pocket and placed it on the table between them. Claire gasped, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up the brooch. "I gave it to her for her last birthday. It's the same one you gave me all those years ago." Paul nodded, feeling another wave of emotion hit him. "Claire, I need to know. Anne, is she your daughter?" Claire finished, her eyes meeting his. A hardness in her voice Paul had never heard before. "Yes, Paul, Anne is your daughter." The world seemed to swirl around Paul. He gripped the edge of the table, struggling to breathe. Why didn't you ever tell me?" Claire's anger finally broke through her calm exterior. "Tell you? And when exactly should I have done that, Paul? When you left for London without looking back? Or maybe when you changed your number and address without leaving a trace?" Paul felt guilt consuming him. "Claire, I'm sorry. I was a coward. I should have—" "Spare me," Claire interrupted, her voice trembling with repressed emotion. "You should have stayed. You should have fought for us, but you chose your career, your ambition. And I was left behind to deal with the consequences." The silence that followed was heavy, laden with 3 decades of unresolved hurt and unspoken words. "What was it like?" Paul finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Raising Anne on your own?" Claire closed her eyes for a moment, as though summoning strength. When she opened them again, there was a blend of pride and exhaustion. "It was hard," she admitted. "I was scared, alone, and heartbroken. But Anne, she gave me strength I never knew I had. I went back to school, became a social worker, dedicated my life to helping other single mothers, other kids who needed support." Paul felt a surge of admiration and regret. "You're incredible, Claire. I should have been there." "Yes, you should have," Claire agreed, her tone softening slightly. "But you weren't. And now, after all these years, you show up because you found Sophie. What's going on, Paul? Why was my granddaughter alone on the street?" Paul hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "Claire, things don't seem to be going well with Anne. Sophie ran away after an argument between you two. She didn't say much, but—" Claire let out a long sigh, worry evident on her face. "Anne has been struggling with depression for years. Recently, things got worse. She lost her job. Bills are piling up. I've tried to help, but she's as stubborn as her mother," Paul finished, a small smile forming on his lips. Claire couldn't help but return a slight smile. "And like her father, apparently—" The brief moment of levity passed quickly, and the heavy reality of the situation settled in again. "What do we do now, Claire?" Paul asked, uncertainty and hope filling his voice. Claire studied him for a long moment before replying, "First, we need to bring Sophie home. Anne must be out of her mind with worry. After that, well, I think we have a lot to talk about, Paul. About the past, about Anne, about the future." Paul nodded, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. "I want to help, Claire. I know I can't erase the last 35 years, but if there's anything I can do for Anne, for Sophie—" "It's complicated, Paul," Claire cautioned. "Anne grew up without a father. She has her own battles, her own scars. And Sophie, well, she's an amazing child, but she's caught in the middle of all this." Paul took a deep breath, feeling the weight of "I understand. But I'm ready to face it, Claire. Please, Just give me a chance to do the right thing this time." Claire looked at him for a long time, as if trying to read his soul. Finally, she nodded slowly. "All right, Paul, but let's take it slow. There's a lot at stake here." They stood, ready to leave the cafe and face whatever came next. As they reached the door, Paul paused, lightly touching Claire's arm. "Claire," he said softly, "despite everything, I want you to know, I never stopped caring. I never stopped—" "No!" Claire interrupted, tears glistening in her eyes. "Don't say that, Paul. Not now. We have a long road ahead before we can even think about anything beyond Anne and Sophie." Paul nodded, respecting her boundaries. As they walked out of the cafe side by side but separated by decades of absence, Paul felt a mixture of fear and hope. The future was uncertain, full of challenges and potential heartbreak, but for the first time in years, he also felt something else: the possibility of redemption. With the butterfly brooch safe in his pocket, a symbol of a past that had never truly left him, Paul braced himself for what lay ahead. A reunion with Anne, the chance to meet his daughter for the first time, and the opportunity to be part of Sophie's life. The road ahead would be difficult, but glancing at Claire beside him, Paul knew he was ready to face it. Together, maybe they could fix what had been broken so long ago and build something new from the fragments of the past. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the city streets as Paul's car wound through increasingly run-down neighborhoods. Claire sat in the passenger seat, her eyes scanning the cracked sidewalks and worn-out buildings, searching for any sign of Anne or Sophie. "Turn left here," Claire instructed, her voice tense. "The last address I have for Anne is in this area." Paul complied, feeling a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach with every block they passed. The harsh reality of his daughter's life, his daughter, became painfully clear. They stopped in front of a decrepit apartment building, its paint peeling and several windows broken. Paul looked at Claire, seeing the pain in her eyes. "Is this it?" he asked softly. Claire nodded, unable to speak. They stepped out of the car, the contrast between Paul's luxury vehicle and the surroundings stark. Climbing the rickety stairs, they were assaulted by the smell of mildew and despair. Graffiti covered the walls, some obscene, others crying out for help in large, desperate letters. On the third floor, Claire stopped at a door marked 307. She hesitated for a moment before knocking. There was no answer. "Anne," Claire called, knocking again. "Anne, honey, it's me. I'm with Paul. Please open up." Silence. Paul gently placed a hand on Claire's shoulder. "Maybe we should ask around the neighborhood." Claire nodded, defeated. They went back down the stairs and began questioning local residents about Anne or Sophie. Hours passed, leading them through dark alleys, abandoned plazas, and overcrowded shelters. With each step, Paul felt the weight of his absence more keenly. These were the consequences of the choice he made 35 years ago, not just for Claire, but for generations who came after him. "She used to come here," said an elderly woman sitting on a bench at a rundown park, pointing to a faded playground. "The pretty young lady with the little girl. Haven't seen them for a few days, though." Paul watched the children playing on the worn-out swings, imagining Sophie there, swinging alone as Anne looked on, fighting her own internal demons. "Paul," Claire's voice brought him back. "Look." She was pointing to a flyer taped to a nearby lamppost. "Depression Support Group. Every Wednesday at 7 p.m., local community center." "Today is Wednesday," Paul said, checking his watch. "It's almost 7. They ran back to the car, renewed hope fueling them. The community center was just a few blocks away. On arrival, they saw a small group of people entering the weathered building. Paul and Claire hurried inside, scanning each face for Anne. That was when Paul spotted her. Even though he'd never met his daughter before, he recognized her instantly. Anne had Claire's eyes, but the stubborn chin was unmistakably his. "Anne," Claire called softly. The young woman turned, her eyes widening at the sight of her mother. "Mom, what are you doing here? And who is—" Her voice trailed off as she looked at Paul, a slow realization dawning in her eyes. "Hi, Anne," Paul said, his voice trembling slightly. I'm your father. The silence that followed was deafening. Anne looked from Claire to Paul, her face a swirl of shock, anger, and confusion. Now? After all these years, you show up now? Anne finally spoke, her voice laden with emotion. Anne, honey, Claire intervened, there's so much we need to talk about, but first, where's Sophie? Anne's face went pale. Sophie, she's not with you. I thought, after our fight, I thought she went to your house, Mum. Panic swept through them all. Sophie had been missing for days, and no one knew. We found her, Paul said quickly. She's safe, at my house. Anne looked at him, relief and distrust mixing in her eyes. Your house? Who are you to take care of my daughter? Paul felt the weight of decades of absence in those words. Anne, I know I have no right, but please, let me help. Let us help. Claire placed a hand on Anne's arm. Sweetie, I know it's a lot to process, but Sophie needs us right now. All of us. Anne closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. When she opened them again, a fierce determination shone there. Take me to my daughter. On the ride back to Paul's mansion, the silence in the car was palpable. Anne sat in the back seat, eyes flicking between the window and the rearview mirror, where she could see Paul's profile. Paul, for his part, felt the weight of every mile. The distance between this impoverished neighborhood where Anne lived and his luxurious home was more than just physical. It was an abyss of experiences, missed opportunities, and decisions that could never be undone. When they finally arrived, Sophie was waiting at the door, her eyes lighting up at the sight of her mother. "Mommy!" she shouted, running into Anne's arms. Anne held her daughter close, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, Sophie, my love, I'm so happy you're okay. I'm so sorry. I really am." Paul watched the scene, feeling like an intruder in his own home. Claire stood beside him, her own tears falling silently. "What do we do now?" Paul asked in a hushed tone. Claire looked at him, years of pain, love, and lost possibilities reflected in her eyes. "Now, Paul, we do what we should have done 35 years ago. We face this together." As the family reunited, full of conflicting emotions and unspoken truths, Paul knew the road ahead would be tough. But looking at Claire, Anne, and Sophie, he also saw something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The search for Anne was over, but the journey to heal old wounds and build a future together was just beginning. The living room of Paul's mansion, normally a tranquil space of quiet luxury, was now steeped in palpable tension. Anne sat stiffly on the leather sofa. Sophie nestled in her arms as though the little girl might vanish at any second. Claire occupied a nearby armchair, her gaze anxiously shifting between her daughter and Paul, who stood uncomfortably in his own home. "So," Anne began, her voice as sharp as a blade, "you're the famous Paul, the man who left my mom before knowing I existed." Paul felt the weight of her words like a punch in the stomach. "And I know nothing I say can justify what I did, but—" "You're right," Anne interrupted, her eyes flashing with pent-up anger. "Nothing can justify 35 years of absence. So why are you here now? What do you want?" Claire leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Anne, sweetheart, I know this is hard, but Paul found Sophie when she was alone and scared. He helped her." Anne pulled Sophie closer. "And I'm supposed to be grateful for that. For doing the bare minimum of human decency." Paul took a step forward, his hands raised in a peaceful gesture. "Anne, I'm not here expecting gratitude or forgiveness. I'm here because I want to help. You and Sophie, you're my family, even if I don't deserve that title." A bitter laugh escaped Anne's lips. "Family? Now you want to be family? Where were you when I cried every night wishing for a dad? Where were you when Mum worked 2 jobs just to give me the basics?" Each of Anne's words hit Paul like arrows, each one finding its mark with painful precision. He staggered slightly, bracing himself against the fireplace. "I made mistakes, Anne. Terrible mistakes I can't undo. But I'm here now, wanting to do whatever it takes to help." Anne looked away, her hands absently stroking Sophie's hair. "And what exactly do you think you can do? Throw money at the problem and hope it goes away?" Paul hesitated, aware that his next words could make or break this fragile attempt at reconciliation. "It's not just about money, Anne. I want to offer real support. Help with treatment for your depression, a safe place for you and Sophie to stay, opportunities for education and employment. Anne's eyes widened, a mixture of surprise and distrust. How do you know about my depression? Claire intervened gently. We were worried, darling. We searched for you. We spoke to people. Anne stood abruptly, carefully setting Sophie on the sofa. So you investigated my life, invaded my privacy. Paul took a step forward, urgency in his voice. Anne, please understand. We were desperate to find you and Sophie. We wanted to help. Help! Anne yelled, years of pain and frustration spilling out. You think you can just show up with your money and promises and fix everything. You have no idea what I've been through, what I still go through every single day. Tears began flowing freely down Anne's face. You don't know what it's like to fight your own mind every day, afraid that at any moment you'll fail your daughter, that you might lose her because you're not strong enough. Paul felt his heart break. Without thinking, he moved toward Anne, arms extended to hug her. For a moment, she allowed it. Decades of longing for a father finally finding release. But then, as quickly as it began, Anne pulled away, wiping her tears angrily. No, I can't do this. I can't just let you into our lives as if nothing happened. Paul stepped back, respecting her space. I understand. I'm not asking you to accept me as your father right away. I'm just asking for a chance to help, to be part of your lives in some way. Claire rose, placing a comforting hand on Anne's shoulder. Honey, I know it's hard to trust, especially after everything you've been through. But maybe we can try. For Sophie's sake, if not our own. Anne looked at her daughter, who watched them with wide, confused eyes. She let out a long sigh, exhaustion evident in every line of her face. I don't know, she finally said. I don't know if I can trust this. What if you decide to leave again? What if it's all too much? I can't risk Sophie getting attached to you, only for you to... Paul felt the knife of her words twist in his heart, but he knew they were justified. Anne, I promise you, right here and now, that I won't leave. No matter how hard it gets, no matter how long it takes, I'll be here, for you, for Sophie, for our family. A heavy silence filled the room. Anne looked hard at Paul as though searching his eyes for the truth. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. I can't promise anything. I can't say I trust you or that I'll ever see you as my dad, but maybe we can try. For Sophie's sake. Baby steps. Paul felt a wave of relief and gratitude wash over him. Baby steps, he agreed. That's all I'm asking for. Claire gave a gentle smile, tears shining in her eyes. Then it's a start. We can work with that. Sophie, sensing something important had happened, stood up and walked over to Anne, taking her hand. Mummy, can we stay here? It's so pretty here. Anne looked from her daughter to Paul and Claire. With a heavy sigh, she nodded. Yes, honey, I think we can stay for a while. As the tension in the room slowly began to ease, Paul knew the path ahead would be long and hard. There were deep wounds to heal, trust to be built, and a fractured family to mend. But gazing at the 3 generations gathered in his living room, he felt, for the first time in years, a spark of genuine hope. The family showdown had been painful but necessary. It was the first step on a journey that Paul hoped would lead to healing and redemption for them all. Paul's office was silent, except for the quiet ticking of the wall clock and the occasional rustle of papers. He was buried in documents, trying to organize a plan to help Anne and Sophie, when a firm knock on the door startled him. Come in, Paul called, adjusting himself in his chair. The door opened, revealing a figure Paul hadn't seen in years. Thomas Hartley, his former partner and mentor in his early career days. Thomas? Paul stood, surprised. What are you doing here? Thomas, now with fully grayed hair and deep lines on his face, stepped into the office with hesitant steps. Hello, Paul. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Paul motioned for Thomas to sit, a mix of curiosity and apprehension growing inside him. No, please, have a seat. It's unexpected to see you after all this time. Thomas settled in the chair, his eyes taking in the luxurious office before finally resting on Paul. You've done well for yourself, kid. I always knew you'd go far. Paul nodded, a tight smile on his lips. Thank you, but something tells me you didn't come here to compliment my success. What's going on, Thomas? The older man took a deep breath, running a hand over his tired face. You're right, Paul. I'm here because there's something I need to confess, something I've been carrying for 35 years. Paul felt his stomach churn. What are you talking about? Thomas looked Paul in the eye, his voice trembling slightly. It's about Claire. About you and Claire, actually. The mention of Claire made Paul's heart race. What about Claire? I interfered in your relationship, Paul, Thomas said, the words sounding as though they were dragged out of him. 35 years ago, when you got that job offer in London, I manipulated the situation, made it seem worse than it really was. Paul felt as if the ground had fallen away beneath his feet. What? How did you manipulate it? Thomas continued, his voice heavy with remorse. The job offer was real, but it wasn't as urgent or exclusive as I made it seem. I exaggerated the terms, pressured you to make a quick decision, made it sound like it was a once-in-a-lifetime chance, that you had to choose between your career and Claire. Paul stood abruptly, his mind spinning. Why? Why would you do that? Thomas lowered his eyes, unable to meet Paul's accusatory gaze. I had big plans for you, Paul. I saw your potential, knew you could become one of the best in the business. But Claire, a serious relationship, maybe a family. I was afraid it would distract you, keep you from reaching your full potential. Paul felt a surge of anger. You had no right. It was my life, Thomas. My decision. I know, Thomas said, raising his hands in a pleading gesture. I was wrong. Terribly wrong. At the time, I justified my actions by telling myself it was for your own good, for the good of the company. But the truth is, I was selfish and manipulative. Paul turned to the window, his hands clenched into fists. 35 years. 35 years of regret, unanswered questions, a life that might have been completely different. Do you have any idea what you did? Paul asked, his voice low and dangerous. What your interference caused? Thomas shook his head sadly. I didn't at the time, but over the years, watching you become colder, more focused only on business, I started to realize the mistake I'd made. And now, hearing rumors about you reconnecting with Claire, about a daughter, Paul turned sharply. How do you know about that? The business world is small, Paul. Word travels fast, Thomas replied. When I heard, I realized I couldn't keep this secret anymore. You deserve to know the truth. Paul sank into his chair, the weight of decades of choices and consequences pressing down on him. 35 years, Thomas. I lost 35 years with my daughter, with Claire. A lifetime. Thomas leaned forward, his voice pleading. I know there's no excuse for what I did, Paul. I'm not here asking for forgiveness. I just wanted you to know the truth. Maybe it's not too late to fix things. Paul looked at Thomas, seeing not the powerful mentor he once admired, but an old, remorseful man. Fix things? How can I fix decades of absence? How can I explain to Anne that I missed her first steps, her first words, her entire childhood because of a lie? Thomas had no answer for that. He stood slowly, the burden of guilt obvious in his slumped shoulders. I'm so sorry, Paul. More than I can say. Try if there's anything I can do. Paul shook his head. You've done enough, Thomas. Please leave. When the door closed behind Thomas, Paul remained where he was, his world turned upside down. All the justifications he had built over the years, all the rationalizations for his choices, they crumbled under this new truth. He picked up a photo on his desk, one that Claire had recently given him. In it, a baby Anne beamed at the camera, her eyes, his eyes, shining with joy. Paul felt hot tears roll down his face. What have I done? He whispered into the silence of the office. In that moment, Paul realized that the journey toward redemption would be far more complex and painful than he had imagined. It was not just about fixing the present, but confronting a past built on lies and manipulation. With trembling hands, he picked up the phone. He needed to talk to Claire, to Anne. He needed to try to explain the inexplicable, to ask forgiveness not only for his actions, but for his blindness, for his willingness to believe the lie because it was convenient. As he dialed Claire's number, Paul wondered if there was any chance to rebuild what had been lost. If, after all these years and all these revelations, there could still be hope for a family that never had the chance to be. The phone rang, and Paul took a deep breath. It was time to face the truth, no matter how painful. Time to fight for the family he almost had, the life that was stolen from him, and the redemption he now knew he needed more than ever. Morning sunlight filtered into Paul's living room, illuminating three figures sitting in tense silence. Paul, Claire, and Anne formed an uneasy triangle, each wrestling with private emotions and uncertainties. Sophie played quietly in the corner, her presence a constant reminder of what was at stake. Paul cleared his throat, breaking the silence. I want to thank you both for agreeing to meet with me today. I know it's not easy. Claire nodded slightly, while Anne kept her gaze fixed on her clasped hands. After Thomas's revelation, Paul continued, his voice trembling, I realized we have even more to resolve than we thought. But I also believe it gives us an opportunity, a chance to start over in a way. Anne finally looked up, her eyes locking with Paul's. Start over? How can we just start over after all this? Claire placed a gentle hand on Anne's arm. Sweetheart, I know it's hard, but for Sophie, maybe we can try. Paul leaned forward, his expression serious. Anne, I know nothing I say can erase the past, but I want to offer my support now, in every way I can. Financially, of course, but also emotionally, if you'll let me. Anne hesitated, distrust still evident in her eyes. And if I don't want your money, if I don't trust your intentions, then we'll start from scratch, Paul answered immediately. No pressure, no expectations, just a chance for us to get to know each other, to build something new. Claire spoke softly. Anne, remember what we talked about. This isn't just about you and Paul. It's about giving Sophie the chance to know her grandfather, to have a complete family. Claire's words seemed to hit Anne deeply. She glanced at Sophie, who now watched them curiously. Okay, Anne finally said, her voice barely audible. We can try, but we go slowly, all right? Paul felt a wave of relief wash over him. Of course, at your pace. Thank you, Anne. It means a lot to me. In the weeks that followed, the family tiptoed through this unfamiliar territory. True to his word, Paul offered financial support for Anne's treatment, ensuring she had access to top mental health professionals. Claire became a constant presence, offering Anne the emotional support she desperately needed. They spent long nights talking, hugging, simply being there through the hard moments, Claire fully dedicating herself to reconnecting with her daughter. Sophie, initially withdrawn and confused by all the changes, gradually began to open up. Paul discovered he had a surprising talent for storytelling, and his elaborate tales of brave princesses and friendly dragons soon became Sophie's favorite part of the evening. One day, as Paul finished one of his stories, Sophie looked at him with her big, curious eyes. Grandpa Paul, why didn't you live with us before? The silence that followed was deafening. Paul felt the weight of Claire and Anne's stares. Swallowing hard, Paul answered carefully. Well, Sophie, sometimes adults make mistakes. I made a very big mistake a long time ago, and it kept me away from your grandma and your mom, but I'm trying to fix that now. Sophie nodded, processing the information the way only a child can. Are you gonna leave again? Paul felt his heart clench. No, sweetheart. I promise I'm not going anywhere. I'm here to stay. Anne, who had been watching closely, felt a swirl of conflicting emotions. Seeing her daughter bond with Paul stirred feelings of both happiness and fear. Later that night, Anne approached Paul in his office. I wanted to thank you, she said hesitantly, for what you said to Sophie and for following through on everything so far. Paul smiled gently. There's no need to thank me, Anne. I'm just trying to do what's right, even if it's too late. Anne paused for a moment before continuing. You know, I always wondered what it would be like to have a father. I grew up hearing stories about you, some good, some not so good. But now, seeing you with Sophie, it's different from what I imagined. Different how? Paul asked, his heart hammering in his chest. Better, Anne admitted. More real, I guess. You're not the monster I sometimes imagined, nor the hero I secretly hoped for. You're human, flawed, but trying. Paul felt tears prick his eyes. Anne, No, she interrupted gently. You don't have to say anything, just keep trying, okay? As Anne left his office, Paul felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. It was a small step, but it felt huge. Challenges, however, remained. There were difficult days when the weight of the past threatened to crush the progress they had made. Anne struggled with relapses in her depression, days when she could barely get out of bed. During those times, Paul and Claire took turns taking care of Sophie and making sure Anne received the support she needed. Claire battled her own demons. Years of hurt and resentment didn't vanish overnight, and there were moments she questioned whether allowing Paul back into their lives was the right decision. One particularly difficult evening, after a heated argument between Paul and Anne over her college grades, Claire found Paul on the balcony, gazing at the stars. "Sometimes I wonder if we're doing the right thing," Claire said softly, joining him. Paul nodded, not taking his eyes off the sky. "Me too. But then I see Sophie's smile, or I catch a glimpse of hope in Anne's eyes, and I know it's worth trying." Claire looked at him then, seeing not the ambitious young man who had left her all those years ago, but someone marked by time and regret, fighting to make amends. "So you know," she said, "despite everything, I'm glad you're here now." Paul turned to her, surprise and gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you, Claire. That means more than you can imagine." Standing side by side under the starry sky, they both felt that, despite the obstacles, they were on the right path. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, there was real hope that this once fractured family could become whole. The shrill ring of the phone cut through the peaceful Sunday morning air in Paul's mansion. Anne, who was helping Sophie with a puzzle in the living room, answered with a look of curiosity. "Hello?" Her voice echoed through the room. What followed brought a visible change over Anne. Her face went pale, her eyes widened, and her free hand began to tremble. Claire, reading a book nearby, noticed immediately and rushed over, worry written all over her face. "Yes, I understand, but please, isn't there any way—" "No, All right, thank you." Anne finished the call, her voice barely above a whisper. "Anne? What happened?" Claire asked, placing a reassuring hand on her daughter's shoulder. Anne looked at her mother, tears threatening to spill. "That was my landlord. I'm being evicted." "I have 1 week to leave." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft sound of Sophie playing, oblivious to the drama unfolding. Paul, drawn by the sudden hush, entered the room. "Is everything all right?" Claire gave Paul a pointed look, silently conveying the gravity of the situation. Anne, for her part, seemed to withdraw, her gaze fixed on some distant point. "Anne just got an eviction notice," Claire explained gently. "Apparently, she only has a week to vacate the apartment." Paul felt his heart clench. In the past months, he had witnessed Anne's slow but steady progress. Seeing her now, so vulnerable and defeated, was painful. "Anne," he began carefully, "I know this is a difficult situation, but I can help. I can easily cover the debts and—" "No!" Anne snapped, her voice raw with emotion. "I don't need your charity, Paul. I can handle this on my own," Claire intervened gently. "Honey, there's no shame in accepting help when we need it. We all go through rough patches." Anne stood abruptly, running her hands through her hair in frustration. "You don't understand. I already feel like a complete failure. I lost my job. I can't take proper care of my daughter, and now this. Taking money from a man I barely know, who was absent my whole life, is just too humiliating." Paul felt each word like a dagger. He knew he deserved them, but it still hurt. "Anne, I understand your pride, but think about Sophie. She needs stability." Mention of Sophie seemed to strike a chord. Anne glanced at her daughter, who was now watching them with large, worried eyes. "Mommy?" Sophie asked, her small voice uncertain. "Are we going to have to leave?" Anne knelt beside Sophie, pulling her into a tight hug. "Don't worry, my love. Mommy will fix everything." Paul and Claire exchanged worried looks. They could see the weight of the situation crushing Anne, and feared what it might mean for her mental health. In the following days, tension filled the house. Anne swung between fierce determination, making frantic calls to find work and housing, and silent despair, locking herself away in her room for hours. Claire did her best to offer emotional support, but she was visibly concerned. "Paul," she confided one night after Anne and Sophie had gone to bed, "I'm scared. Anne is on the verge of a breakdown, I can feel it, and Sophie, she's withdrawing more and more." Paul nodded grimly. He had noticed the change in Sophie. The once talkative, cheerful girl now spent long stretches in silence, clutching her teddy bear like a lifeline. "I want to help, Claire," Paul said, frustration evident in his voice. "But every time I mention any kind of financial assistance, Anne shuts down completely. I don't want to come off as controlling or force my will, but we also can't stand by and watch our daughter and granddaughter suffer," Claire finished softly. Paul agreed, feeling the burden of responsibility on his shoulders. He knew he had to find a solution, and fast. The next morning, Paul called a family meeting. Anne entered the living room cautiously, eyes red and puffy from another sleepless night. Claire followed, with Sophie clinging tightly to her hand. "Anne," Paul began, his tone gentle but firm, "I know you don't want to hear this, but we need to talk about your current situation." Anne opened her mouth to protest, but Paul raised a hand to ask for silence. "Please, let me finish. I understand your desire for independence, and I respect it. I'm not offering charity or trying to control your life. I'm proposing a partnership." That captured Anne's attention. "What kind of partnership?" Paul took a deep breath before continuing. "I'd like to offer you a loan, not a gift. Enough money to cover your current debts and give you a fresh start. But more than that, I want to invest in your future." Anne frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "Education," Paul clarified. "You mentioned that you always wanted to do a postgraduate degree in psychology, but never had the resources. I'm willing to fund your studies as an investment in your future and Sophie's." Claire, who knew of Paul's plan from the previous night, added, "Think of it as an opportunity to build the life you've always wanted for you and Sophie, dear. It's not charity. It's a chance to start over." Anne remained silent for a long moment, her face a storm of conflicting emotions. Finally, she looked at Sophie, who watched them all with large, hopeful eyes. "What if I fail?" Anne whispered, her voice barely audible. "What if I can't handle all this?" At that moment, Paul saw the deep fear and insecurity Anne carried. It wasn't just pride keeping her from accepting help. It was a profound fear of failure. Paul approached cautiously, placing a gentle hand on Anne's shoulder. "You won't fail, Anne, and even if you stumble along the way, we'll be here to help you get back up. All of us. That's what families do." His words seemed to break something within Anne. Tears began to fall freely, years of tension and fear finally finding release. Sophie, seeing her mother cry, ran to hug her. "Don't cry, Mommy. It'll be okay. We have Grandpa Paul and Grandma Claire now." Anne hugged her daughter tightly, looking over Sophie's head at Paul and Claire. I think we can try this," she finally said, her voice quivering. Relief flooded the room. Claire joined the hug, and after a moment of hesitation, Paul did too. For an instant, they were simply a family, bonded by love and concern for each other. In the days that followed, the details were ironed out. Paul worked with his lawyers to structure the loan and educational agreement in a way that respected Anne's independence, but also provided the security she and Sophie needed. Anne began researching graduate programs, a spark of excitement in her eyes that had been missing for a long time. Sophie, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, gradually returned to her playful, curious self. One evening, as Paul watched Anne and Sophie laughing together over a storybook, he felt a gentle hand on his shoulder. It was Claire, tears of quiet joy in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply, "for not giving up." "For finding a way," Paul smiled, a surge of emotion running through him. "I promised I'd do whatever it took to fix this. This is just the beginning." As they stood there, watching the domestic scene unfold, Paul knew the road ahead was still long. Reclaiming 35 lost years would not be easy, and there would be more obstacles. But for the first time in a long while, he felt genuine hope for the future, a hope that this once fractured family could finally heal and become whole again. The months following the eviction scare were an emotional roller coaster for everyone involved. Paul's mansion, once a symbol of his loneliness and material success, had become the backdrop of a family striving to reconnect and mend old wounds. Anne, determined to seize the opportunity she had been given, threw herself into her graduate studies. Still, her battle with depression persisted, with days where she could barely leave her bed, punctuating stretches of intense productivity. One particularly tough morning, Paul found Anne curled up on the library couch, silent tears running down her cheeks. "Anne," he called softly, hesitant to invade her space. She looked up, her red, tired eyes meeting his. "I can't do this, Paul. I'm not strong enough." Paul took a seat beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. "You're stronger than you think, Anne. Look at how much you've already overcome. But what if I fail? What if I let Sophie down? Let all of you down?" Paul's heart clenched. "Anne, listen to me. There's nothing you could do that would make us give up on you. We're family. We're here for the good days and the bad." Those words seemed to penetrate deeply. Anne nodded, wiping her tears. "Thank you, Dad." It was the first time Anne had called him that, and Paul felt a rush of emotion. It was just a small step, but a vital one. Meanwhile, Paul faced his own challenges. Accustomed to closing million-dollar deals and navigating high-level negotiations, he now found himself grappling with how to be a hands-on grandfather. "Grandpa, can you tie my shoe?" Sophie asked one day, extending her tiny foot. Paul stared at the shoelace as if it were a complex puzzle. He could close international deals, but tying a child's shoelace seemed beyond him. Claire, watching with an amused smile, gently intervened. "Here, let me show you both." Patiently, she guided Paul's hands, teaching him to make the perfect bow. Sophie's radiant grin when he finally succeeded was more gratifying than any business deal he'd ever sealed. Claire, meanwhile, became the emotional anchor of the family. Her experience as a social worker proved invaluable during moments of conflict. "You both need to communicate," she said firmly, during a particularly heated argument between Paul and Anne about her grades. "Paul, Anne is an adult capable of managing her own studies. Anne, your father is just worried and wants to help." Under Claire's patient guidance, the family learned to navigate their differences, finding a delicate balance between independence and mutual support. Sophie, at the center of it all, blossomed under the care of her newly reunited family. Her laughter echoed through the mansion's halls, breathing life into a place that had for so long been cold and silent. Yet even Sophie had moments of insecurity. One evening, Paul found her quietly crying in her room. "What's wrong, Princess?" he asked, sitting on the edge of her bed. "Grandpa," Sophie sniffled. "Do you promise you won't leave me, like my friend Sarah's dad left her?" Paul felt his heart break. He pulled Sophie into a tight hug. "I promise, Sophie, never, ever will I leave you or your mom. We're in this together, forever." It was amid this delicate balance of growth and healing that the unthinkable happened. Sophie, always so full of life, awoke one morning with a high fever and difficulty breathing. The following hours were a blur of ambulance sirens, hospital corridors, and doctors using incomprehensible medical terms. Sophie was diagnosed with severe pneumonia and rushed to the ICU. Suddenly, all the minor conflicts and insecurities that had plagued the family seemed insignificant. United by fear and concern for Sophie, Paul, Claire, and Anne found themselves closer than ever. During the long nights of vigil in the hospital, amid the beeping machines and the nurses' rounds, barriers that had lingered for months finally began to crumble. "You know," Anne said quietly one night, her eyes fixed on Sophie's sleeping form, "when I was little, I used to imagine what it would be like if you were around, Dad." Surprised by her sudden openness, Paul leaned forward. "What was it like?" Anne gave a sad smile. "In my imagination, you were this flawless hero who'd show up and fix everything. Reality is more complicated, but, in some ways, better." Claire, listening quietly, added, "We're all imperfect, dear. But it's our flaws that make us human, that allow us to grow and love truly. The nights wore on, and amid the hum of machines and the routine of the hospital, the family shared stories they had never told. Paul spoke of the loneliness of his success, the emptiness no amount of money could fill. Anne revealed her deepest fears of inadequacy as a mother. Claire opened up about her years of struggle and sacrifice, raising Anne alone. Every story, every confession, was a brick in the foundation of a new family structure, one built not on expectations or obligations, but on mutual understanding and acceptance. After what felt like an eternity, Sophie began to show signs of improvement. Her first faint smile was like a beam of sunlight after a long storm. When the day finally came for Sophie to be discharged, the family left the hospital changed. The experiences shared in those last weeks had forged bonds stronger than any blood tie. Back at the mansion, as they watched Sophie gleefully playing in the garden, Paul had an epiphany. All his life, he had measured success by wealth and business achievements, but now, seeing his reunited family, he realized what true wealth meant. "You know," he said to Claire and Anne, who stood beside him, "I spent so much time accumulating fortune, thinking that would bring me happiness, but now I see that real wealth is here, in this family we've built." Anne smiled, placing a hand on Paul's shoulder. "Better late than never, right, Dad?" Claire nodded, tears glimmering with joy in her eyes. It's never too late for family. In that moment, Paul made a decision. He would use his resources not just for his immediate family's future, but to make a real difference in the community. Plans for a foundation to help families in similar situations began forming in his mind. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, bathing the garden in golden light, Paul felt a peace he had never before experienced. The road ahead would still have its challenges, but now they would face them together as a true family. Sophie ran over, her laughter echoing in the evening air. "Grandpa, Grandma, Mom, come play with me." And so 3 generations dashed across the lawn, their laughter mingling in the twilight, a testimony to the healing power of family love and the resilience of the human spirit. The garden of Paul's mansion was unrecognizable. Colorful balloons bounced in the breeze, festive banners decorated the trees, and the sound of children's laughter filled the air. At the center of it all was Sophie, now a 6-year-old bundle of energy, running between the guests with a radiant smile. "Grandpa Paul! Grandpa Paul!" she shouted, hurrying toward Paul, who was chatting with some guests. "Look what Mom gave me!" Paul crouched down, smiling as he admired the small necklace of faux pearls Sophie proudly displayed. "It's beautiful, Princess. You look like a real lady." Not far away, Anne watched the scene with a gentle smile. A year had passed since that rainy night, and the transformation was remarkable. Her eyes, once clouded by depression, now shone with renewed determination. She excitedly discussed a case from her graduate studies in family counseling with a colleague by her side. Claire approached, slipping an arm around Anne's shoulders. "You okay, sweetheart?" Anne nodded, leaning into her mother's embrace. "I am, Mom." "Better than I've been in a long time," Claire smiled, proud of Anne's strength and resilience. She herself had undergone major changes in the past year. Backed by Paul's new foundation, Claire now led an innovative program to support families in vulnerable situations, making a real impact in the community. The party continued, full of games, laughter, and precious moments. When it was time to sing Happy Birthday, everyone gathered around the elaborately butterfly-shaped cake. After the candles were blown out and slices of cake were handed around, Paul asked for everyone's attention. He was holding a small velvet box. "Sophie," he began, voice filled with emotion. "A year ago, fate brought us together in an unexpected way. And with you came this special brooch." He opened the box, revealing the butterfly brooch that had played such a crucial role in their lives. Paul turned to Claire, handing her the brooch. "Claire, you kept this safe for so many years, holding on to the hope of our family." Claire, tears in her eyes, took the brooch and passed it to Anne. "Anne, my dear daughter, you are the bridge between our past and our future, the living proof of the love Paul and I once shared." Anne, overwhelmed, held the brooch for a moment before kneeling in front of Sophie. "And now, my love, This brooch belongs to you. May it always remind you of the love that binds us, no matter what happens." Sophie accepted the brooch reverently, her eyes shining with emotion. She fastened it carefully to her dress, smiling at her gathered family. Later, as the party began winding down and guests departed, Paul found Claire alone in the garden, gazing at the first stars twinkling in the dusk sky. "Claire," he called softly, approaching her. She turned, smiling at the sight of him. "Paul, it was a wonderful party." Paul nodded, heart pounding. "Claire, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have said 35 years ago." Claire looked at him curiously, waiting for him to continue. "I love you," Paul said, his voice trembling slightly. "I always have, and if you'll give me a second chance, I promise to spend the rest of my life proving it to you." Claire was silent for a moment, tears brimming in her eyes. Then, with a gentle smile, she reached out and intertwined her fingers with his. "I love you too, Paul. I don't think I ever stopped." In the days that followed, the family began making plans for the future. Paul and Claire announced their engagement, hoping for a small, intimate ceremony with only their closest loved ones. Inspired by her parents' reconciliation, Anne threw herself into her studies and treatment with renewed vigor. With Claire's enthusiastic support, Paul expanded his foundation, partnering with local organizations to help even more families in need. Sophie, basking in her family's unconditional love, grew more confident and joyful each day. A few weeks later, the family decided to visit the grocery store where it had all begun a year ago. As they walked the aisles, Paul pushing the cart with Sophie perched inside, Claire and Anne chatted excitedly about new recipes they wanted to try. Sophie, proudly wearing the butterfly brooch, looked around with bright eyes. "Grandpa," she said, "do you remember when you found me here?" Paul smiled, playfully ruffling Sophie's hair. "How could I forget, Princess? It was the day my life changed forever." Leaving the store, the sun shone brilliantly, bathing them in golden light. Sophie hopped out of the cart, taking Paul and Claire's hands. Anne walked beside them, pushing the groceries. An elderly lady passing by smiled at the family scene. "What a lovely family," she commented. Paul and Claire exchanged emotional glances, their hands meeting over Sophie's head. Anne smiled, feeling a surge of gratitude for all they had overcome together. As they made their way to the car, the image was one of pure happiness, a family united, walking hand in hand under the bright sun. The butterfly brooch sparkled on Sophie's chest, a shining symbol of love, forgiveness, and the endless possibilities the future held for them all. And so, where a story of separation and pain had begun long ago, a new story of love, redemption, and family was flourishing, promising a bright future filled with hope. The sound of laughter and the warmth of togetherness now filled every corner of their lives. For a family once broken by time and circumstance, the promise of tomorrow shone as brightly as the butterfly wings that had guided them back to each other.